It is 12 p.m. It looks like we still have some people joining, so we'll wait another couple minutes.
Hi, Christian. All good on YouTube.
Yeah, wonderful, thank you. And maybe just one more minute, seeing some last numbers coming in. All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. All right. Welcome, everyone. And to those of you who have joined us for the last couple of webinars, welcome back. Today is yet another DOSITS webinar for 2024. Our webinar topics today will be Multibeam Echosounders. And today we have two speakers joining us to talk to us about Multibeam Echosounders. We have Michael Smith, who is a marine acoustician who's joining us from Kongsberg Discovery. Mike's background is working with Multibeam Echosounders in ocean mapping in shallow water. He has done a variety of work on these systems and specifically relating to system calibration and data collection for acoustic backscatter that is used for ocean mapping. So he's going to talk to us a little bit about that today. And today we also have Dr. Hilary Cates-Varghese, who is a marine bioacoustician with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. And her work is focused on understanding the impacts that underwater noise has on marine life, specifically in the area of ocean energy development. And she is going to talk to us today about some bioacoustic analysis involving multibeam echosounders. So before we dive into our wonderful talks today, if you are joining us over Zoom, then you should see something like this on your screen. In the bottom left corner, you'll see audio settings. So if you want to turn on closed captioning or subtitles, then you can do that through those options. We also have a chat box and a Q&A panel. So for the remainder of this talk, if you have any questions to ask to the speakers or to the DOSITS panelists, then you can open up the Q&A panel and ask your question in there. We, as the DOSITS panel, will field those questions throughout the webinar. And then at the end, if there are any remaining questions, we'll have a chance to ask the speakers and have them give their answers as well. For everything else, any other comments, please just use the chat box function. We won't really be monitoring the chat box function. So if you ask a question in there, then we probably won't see it. So please just ask your questions in the Q&A box. If you are joining us, right, so this is what that chat box looks like. And then if you're joining us over YouTube, then you can ask your question in the comment section on YouTube, and our representatives will copy that over to the Q&A, so that way your questions are heard as well. So now I would like to pass the reins to Michael Smith, who is going to be giving his talk on multibeam echosounders.
Great, thank you for the introduction. I'm going to just share my presentation real quick, and we'll be underway. All righty, so can we see the slides? That looks perfect. All righty, so again, thank you for the opportunity to talk with you all about multibeam echosounders. My goal today is to give you somewhat of a broad overview of what these systems are, why we use them, how they're designed, what the radiation patterns are, and how we approach modeling them for acoustical impact purposes. So I'd like to start off by touching on that why we use them purpose. So these are a tool for high resolution mapping of the sea floor. And I've included this image from the JEDCO bathymetric chart to show that it looks like we kind of do have a map of the seafloor. We can see variations in the depths across the various oceans, but there's a different reality that underlies this image. And what it actually is a lot of low resolution satellite-derived bathymetry. In reality, for the most part, only 26.1% of the ocean has been mapped at a significantly high resolution. To put this number in perspective, we actually have better maps of Venus and Mars than we do of our own planet. So this is a pretty big task and an important task to complete. And the Multibeam Echosounder is the tool we use to do this. To just underscore exactly what I mean about the difference between satellite-derived bathymetry and multibeams, here we can see what it looks like when we're looking at a underwater mountain with satellite-derived bathymetry. We can tell that there's a high somewhere here, but not much beyond that. It's only when we use multi-beam echosounders that we can really see what is underneath the ocean. And it's this type of image that we can use for exploration purposes and go back diving with ROVs and submersibles to learn more about what's hidden in the marine environment. Now, multi-beam echosounders, they're not just tools for exploration. They are featured in a number of marine applications. One of the most important applications is safety of navigation for our inland waterways. The charts that we use to go in and out of ports are often derived from multi-beam information, and we often have to resurvey areas, particularly in response to significant changes like hurricanes or including the Francis Scott Key Bridge event. Not only do we get information from the bathymetry, we're also able to look at how the seafloor varies in terms of its composition. And this is actually quite important for natural resource exploration, as well as looking at habitat modeling and identifying areas that are particularly important for marine life. We can also use multi-beams to look at the water column, looking at fisheries and schools of fish, or trying to observe even something as small as bubbles all the way at the sea floor from methane seeps, which is an important component in the flux of carbon in and out of the marine environment. So I think the point I want to leave you with here is that multi-beams actually play a really key role for our ability to maintain our exploration and navigation in the marine environment, as well as help to sustain a global marine economy. So now that we know what a multi-beam echosounder is used for, let's start to dig into what's unique about them. And before we can do that, we should probably do a quick review on what a single beam echosounder is. This is something that was presented on in a prior DOSITS seminar, but here I'll just do a quick review. So single beam echosounders are a type of sonar that's oriented downwards facing the seafloor. The sound it generates travels through the water, is reflected off the sea floor, and returns to the sonar. Now, for single beams, they generally focus their acoustic energy within a cone or a beam of sound that travels down. From this, we use the amount of travel time for that echo to determine the depth or range, which we often call sounding. In addition to the soundings, like I alluded in the prior slides, we also get additional information from our transmissions. So the acoustic intensity in both the water column as well as the seafloor tell us something about what's going on in that space. And so this is just a small mock-up of what an echo signature would look like and what we pick from it. Now, multi-beams, they take this concept of the single beam and they expand upon it. And they do that through some unique array design. So the first thing we'll notice on the left side here is that for multi-beam echosounders, they generally have two distinct arrays. Shown in red is the transmitter array, and shown in blue is the receiver array. Now, both of these arrays are typically comprised of transducer elements. And in the case of the transmitter array, the transducer elements are an active acoustic source. For the receiver array, we typically see these used in a passive acoustic sense, and they're quite often best thought of as hydrophones. Now, what's unique for multibeams is that the transmitter and the receiver array are aligned orthogonally in what's known as a Mills cross formation. And it's this formation that allows an interesting interaction between the two beam patterns of the array. So we can see here with the transmitter array, which is long in this direction, that it produces a relatively narrow, focused region of sound, that it's narrow from bow to stern, but wide from port to starboard. And the receiver array, which will collect the echo generated by that transmitter array, will actually have a beam pattern that's aligned orthogonally to the transmitter, which we can see here in blue. Now, we use the cross section and the overlap between these two beam patterns to get the strongest signal return. And it's through here that we're able to define our depth soundings, which we can see right here. So this is the fundamental operation for a multibeam. I just want to show some real life examples. We're going to start by looking at shallow water multibeams. So here we can see a couple examples. We can see that Mills cross formation where these two arrays are aligned orthogonally, 90 degrees to each other. And for shallow water arrays, we typically want to use them in depths that are less than 600 meters and as shallow as less than a meter in depth. What makes these work really well in these depths is that they are shorter arrays and they have higher frequencies on the order of 100 to 800 kilohertz. They feature very short pulse lengths and relatively lower source levels. But if we want to map the deepest depths, we have to use deep water systems. And so here I'm showing some examples and characteristics of deep water multibeam Echosounders. So these systems use much lower frequencies from 10 to 70 kilohertz and higher source levels, 220 to 240 dB, to be able to reach those deep ocean depths. Now, we can see from the pictures here that these systems tend to have array lengths that are quite large. These are installation gondolas that go on the bottom of a ship where we would insert the multibeam into this structure. Now, the arrays that we're looking at here are on the order of almost 8 meters in length. And for this gondola in particular, I'd just like to note that our deep water multibeam is clearly seen here in this position. We have some single beam Echosounders, and this square here also includes one of our shallow water systems for comparison. So I've talked about these systems generating kind of a narrow swath of sound. So what do I mean by that? Well, on the left, I have some classical beam patterns of a multi-beam Echosounder. We can see this long ship beam pattern running bow to stern, where this point here is our main beam or our main lobe. It's where we focus most of that energy. And this is typically on the order of a degree in width. The long ship beam pattern, again, it's quite wide and it runs from port to starboard. And I typically like to look at these things in 3D to get a better sense of how they move or how they're generated within the environment. So here we're just circling around this beam pattern to show that it's three-dimensional. It's not just a 2D slice. You'll also note that aside from the main beam, we have sound that's generated at other angles. These secondary lobes shown here are called side lobes, and they're undesirable, both from an operational perspective as well as from a sound in the water perspective. And so manufacturers work pretty hard to reduce the level of these side lobes. And we can see here that the side lobes are generally around 30 dB less than the main lobe. Now, given that we have a classical radiation pattern, I wanted to just briefly look at some newer technologies that we employ for the deep water systems. When a system like a deep water system is operating in the marine environment, it's subject to the motion of waves and ship and vessel movement. And this impacts how the system ends up distributing the soundings on the seafloor. And that's what this figure is showing here. Each of the black crosses is a sounding. And we can see that as the vessel moves and tilts and rolls, that it bunches up and it spreads out. Now, this is not ideal when we want to make a map of the seafloor. We want an even sounding density distribution. So manufacturers have developed technologies that help improve this. One of these is multi-sector technology, which uses some techniques to take our single swath and segment it into a series of smaller independent swaths. And what we'll do is we'll steer these swaths forward and aft, and that will allow us to compensate for the motion. The other technology is multi-swath. This is something we use to improve the along track sounding density, because with deep water systems, when we transmit sound and we're looking and receiving our echoes, it can take upwards of 6 to 12 seconds for that sound to travel there and back. So if we can get a better density in the along track, we'll shoot for that. Now, the reason I bring this up is because it changes how the sound we generate goes into the water, as well as the radiation pattern. So on the left, we can see that across track beam pattern that we're accustomed to. And for multi-sector technology, what we do, like I said, is we segment it into smaller independent swaths. And so here we can see that we have now 8 independent sectors with their own main lobes, as well as their own sectors, side lobes within the across-track sector. And the way we actually achieve this is by firing each sector independently as a single pulse. So we go from a single ping to a ping cycle. For multi-swath, we repeat this process and essentially fire out 2 pings in rapid succession. We'll direct the pings a little forward and a little aft in space, and that'll allow us to cover independent and non-overlapping ground. I now want to go through a couple of these images to help better solidify this concept and why it's important. So in this top left image, we're actually looking at the sectors as they're fired. They'll fire from the inside, and then they'll move outside, and then they'll fire the secondary swath right after. What this looks like from a time series perspective is shown here, where we can see each sector transmission is sent in order. And we can actually see different types of sound waves used. We have a continuous wave used for the first 4 sectors, and then frequency modulated waves for the next 4 sectors. And then finally, out here on the right, I just wanted to highlight that each of these sectors does have its own independent 3D beam pattern. And this is something that we need to consider as we move forward to model these systems. So now I want to dig into the frequency content of the Multibeam Echosounder pulses. Here we're looking at a recording of a 12 kilohertz deep water Multibeam Echosounder. This drove over top of a hydrophone placed at about 1,200 meters below the surface. We can clearly see in the time series our 8 independent sectors. These are all CW waves. And here on the bottom is our spectrogram, showing that each of these occupies an independent signal bandwidth. We also can note that there are harmonics. This is something that we do expect to see in real systems, but they are generally higher in frequency and significantly lower in magnitude. Now, I also have recordings of this. I've added these to, or submitted these to the DOSITS website, and we can review them in our own time. But I figured I'd try and play them here to give an example of what these signals sound like. So this first recording is going to be of the ship as it drives by the hydrophone, and you'll be able to hear a couple quiet pings and then 1 to 2 loud pings as it goes over the hydrophone and then quiets again. And I have added some gain so that we can be able to hear it. Now, if you can't hear that, that's okay. This is at the upper edge of our frequency range for human hearing. And if you went to one too many rock concerts, you might not be able to hear it. But I have taken the signal shown on the screen here, and I've slowed it down so we can hear those chirps in a lower pitch so that you can understand how that frequency varies with each of these independent pulses. And so that's what I'm going to play now. I'll play it one more time. So you can see that this is a very rapid signal. For this 8-sector single swath mode, it only takes up about 200 milliseconds of time. The last characteristic I want to describe about these systems before moving into how we approach them from a modeling perspective is to discuss their source levels. So when we hear that they have a source level of 204 dB, this seems like a rather loud number. However, we have to think about it in terms of its practicality. We can't actually ever reach 240 dB with these systems. This is what we would call an effective source level. It's a figure of merit that we use to estimate system and performance in the far field. And so I'm showing this diagram below that delineates two kind of important regions: the far field, where we design our systems to operate, and the near field, where the signals from these systems don't generally interact in an in-phase or coherent manner. And this ends up serving to reduce the actual signal level in that space. And so what's interesting with multibeams is that the near field region that is specific to these systems is quite large. And this is due to their long lengths of these arrays, for the deep water systems being 8 meters, as well as their higher frequencies. So for a deep water system, we can expect to have a near field distance on the order of 300 to 500 meters. And I did do some modeling to try and show how this actually manifests. And so here on the left, what I've done is I've taken a 12 kilohertz multibeam with an 8 meter array length. This is just the transmitter. And I've modeled the sound pressure level with respect to range from the center of the array. Now in black, we've done a very simple approach, which is to take the source level and subtract from it the sound propagation losses. But in blue, what I've done is I've actually created each little signal from each of those elements. And I've made sure to account for the distance, the time delay, and the phase of the waveform so that we can appropriately sum and get a proper metric for that level. On the right, what I've done is I've actually modeled what that radiation pattern looks like at a specific range. And so we'll see that the red bar here will sweep through the range, and we'll observe how our radiation pattern doesn't really look like what I've shown in the prior slides when we're in the near field. It actually takes quite a while for that radiation pattern to converge to the type of narrow swath that we expect. In this case, it actually starts to converge out at around 400 meters away. And like I said, we can observe here with the more accurate model that our signal levels, particularly in the near field, are really reduced on the order of 30 dB. And this becomes important when we go to model these systems for acoustical impact purposes. So we will shift gears now to propagation modeling. This is generally a two-pronged approach, and there is a prior webinar that goes through this in much more detail. We're just going to focus on the sound propagation modeling portion, which is where we look to couple our multi-beam radiation patterns to an environmental model, receive some acoustic metrics out of those models, and then apply thresholds, which we can see in the tables here. In this top table, these are the acoustic thresholds for physiological impact. And here on the bottom table, we have the thresholds for behavioral impact. So the best way I've seen to model these systems is using ray-based propagation models. It allows us to do this quickly, easily couple in the radiation patterns. And a classical example of a ray-based model would be bellhop. And so you can see here, what I've done is I've input the radiation patterns for a 12 kilohertz multi-beam echosounder into bellhop and modeled what's essentially an empty iso velocity space. One of the things you'll note is that we can see each of these independent sectors. That's an important consideration when we go to model these systems, as they are distinct and independent. And so in order to get a single picture of this, we actually have to do the modeling once for each of those sectors and each of those swaths, because they each have their own independent bandwidth. So you can see here for SPL, what I've done is I've taken each of the sector's results and I've collapsed them by taking the maximum value within the field. When we look to derive sound exposure level, it'll be important to actually sum the individual contributions of each sector across each field point. And the last point I'll add to this is that the near field is not easy to couple into these models. they are typically operating under a far field assumption. So here I'm just showing a couple kind of classic examples of the outputs of propagation models. Here on the left, we're looking at the cross-track swath and what the received levels in the field is with respect to that orientation. We can see that the loudest returns come from within this kind of bell-shaped curve of the refractive environment, where the direct arrival is likely to occur. For a different orientation, say the along track, we can see that the response is primarily going to be dominated by the side lobe levels. On the right here, we've converted our sound pressure level to sound exposure level. We've done the appropriate steps to weight this for various animal hearing groups. In this case, we're looking at the mid-frequency cetaceans, and we're applying those acoustic thresholds from the prior slide to see what their spatial extent is. And one of the things that's different between these two figures that I'm showing here is that in the top figure, we've applied the thresholds and gotten a specific range, but I've actually added the near field correction in this bottom figure. And we can observe how that range has shrunk because of the lower levels associated with the transmission in the near field. So the last bit of this that I want to touch upon, I've seen that it's common for multi-beam echosounders to be compared to mid-frequency active sonars. This is a different type of system, but they share similar source levels. They also share a narrow band pulse nature, and they are technically some of the closest in frequency with respect to the types of sources that we look at for impact purposes. However, this is kind of where the similarities end. For multi-beam echosounders, the highly directional radiation pattern means that we'll have a different view of the sound exposure level. In this case here on the left, we have what would be the maximal exposure in the cross-track. And this is a very rare or unlikely scenario to be in. Whereas the bearing 0 shown here on the right, this is something that's more common to be experienced. This is when we're in our side lobe regime. When we couple this with the short pulse lengths on the order of milliseconds and the long ping cycles, we can see that the primary driver of the sound exposure level for these systems will end up being how many times something is exposed to a main beam transmission. For naval mid-frequency active sonar, I've just briefly modeled this using the models from the 2000 Bahama strandings. And what you can see here is that for these systems, they have a somewhat near omnidirectional, horizontally focused radiation pattern. So whereas most of the energy in the multi-beam is sent downwards, a significant amount of energy for these sonars is directed horizontally, and they have longer transmission periods on the order of 1 to 3 seconds. And so it represents a much different sound exposure level situation. The last bit I'll touch upon is I've seen some common mitigation approaches like the safety radius, where multi-beam echosounders don't quite fit into that existing methodology. You see, I think the acoustic guidance and approaches for mitigating acoustic sources were written when multi-beam echosounders were in their infancy. And so they kind of don't fit. And the way I've tried to show this is by looking at a 30 kilohertz deep water system and applying 160 dB, so that behavioral acoustic threshold isopleth, and looking at its extent from a top-down view. We can certainly see that there's a 1,200 meter stretch in the port and starboard direction for the isopleth, but in any other direction, it's actually only about 30 meters wide. So this is quite a reduction in the operational area if we were to use a safety radius versus the actual potential for exposure to the acoustic threshold. So that's all I have. I think at this point, we can hand it off to Hillary.
Okay, it looks like you have to stop sharing so I can share. Great.
So just as Hillary is getting her slide set up, I do see a couple questions in the chat. And just to remind everyone, if you are asking some questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and we will field them throughout the talk. And if we don't get to them throughout the talk, then we will ask the speakers to answer them at the end of this webinar. All right, so thank you. And Hillary, you are all set to go.
Okay, great. Thank you. And you can hear me okay and see the slides? Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Mike, for a great introduction to multibeams. We're now going to spend the rest of our time together discussing the potential impact of multibeams on the marine acoustic environment and marine life. So what do we know about the interaction of multibeams and marine life? Concern arose about the potential impact of multibeam echo sounders on marine life back in 2008, when about 100 melon-headed whales stranded off of Madagascar. An investigative team was put together to try and understand the cause of the stranding. Among other potential causes, a multibeam survey that occurred in a similar time frame, although 70 kilometers away from the stranding site, was one of the potential causes they considered. Ultimately, the expert team could not unequivocally conclude a cause and effect relationship between the multibeam echo sounder survey and the stranding. Some studies on the subject of echo sounders came about in the years after that provided some insight on the potential interaction of echo sounders and marine life. For example, one lab study identified the harmonics that exist when generating a short signal, reinforcing the need to consider more than just the nominal operating frequency when assessing potential impacts. Although harmonics are something to consider, as Mike showed us earlier, the harmonics of these systems are significantly quieter than the made frequency content of the signal, so certainly not the primary concern of these systems. Another study showed that captive gray seals do indeed move away from a multibeam when the source is played in their tank. There have been a few field studies that looked at the effect of single beam echo sounder activity on wild marine mammal behavior. For example, Vyers found that no change in the foraging behavior of beaked whales during an acoustic survey with a single beam echo sounder. Quick et al. Found no change in the foraging behavior of short-fin pilot whales, but did find that the animals increased their heading variance when the echo sounder was active, suggesting increased vigilance to the sound source. Cholowiak et al. Found that the number of foraging clicks they detected by beaked whales was substantially less when the echo sounder was active than when inactive, but that animals did not leave the acoustic survey area. Taken together, these studies show the potential for behavioral responses by marine mammals when echo sounders are active, though the biological significance of these responses on the animals is unclear. They also highlight the context and species-specific variability in response. There have also been a few modeling reports on the potential of multibeam echo sounders to interact with marine life, which showed that the risk of direct insonification by a multibeam that could lead to auditory damage is low. It wasn't until 2020 that a dedicated empirical study was published looking at the potential effect of multibeams on wild marine mammals. But before I get into that, I want to circle back to a point that Mike made earlier. So multibeam echo sounders are used for many different purposes, from mapping the world's oceans to monitoring for marine life, and each of these purposes requires a purpose-designed system. Therefore, not every application involving a multibeam is the same. High-frequency systems, hundreds of kilohertz, with very fine resolution for resolving targets are used for identifying features on the seafloor or mapping safe navigation corridors. But high-frequency multibeams can also be used for monitoring for marine life, such as around a wave power site. In this latter application, the geometry would be quite different, scanning horizontally instead of vertically. High-frequency systems, however, are not adequate for mapping deep water environments, as high frequencies attenuate quite rapidly. These differing applications, therefore, have the potential for different impacts on marine life and the acoustic environment. When we think about the potential for a sound to impact marine life in the wild, we often focus on the spatiotemporal and spectral overlap. Arguably, the multibeam with the greatest potential to impact marine life is one that has a large acoustic footprint, particularly a high source level and low propagation loss. It's used in areas where marine life is found and when they are present, and overlaps in frequency content with the hearing range of that marine life. Several multibeam systems are so high frequency that they are outside of the audible frequency range of marine life. Generally speaking, these are the systems that are over 200 kilohertz in frequency. Not only are they outside the hearing range of marine life, but they also suffer significant propagation loss as they radiate into the environment. So the empirical studies I will talk about today represent a scenario with the potential, with high potential for marine life and multibeams to interact. What I'll talk about today is an empirical study looking at the effect of a deep water mapping survey utilizing the lowest frequency multibeam, a 12 kilohertz system, on beaked whale foraging behavior. So why does this serve as a scenario with high potential for interaction? The 12 kilohertz deep water multibeam has the largest acoustic footprint of any multibeam due to its source level and low frequency nature. The species considered here, Cuvier's beaked whales, are known to be sensitive to other sounds like mid-frequency active sonar, or MFAS. This species has a hearing range and sensitivity that overlaps with the 12 kilohertz multibeam signal. These animals are also found in the deep waters where this multibeam would be appropriate to use. And finally, foraging is an important behavior to this animal's livelihood, so a disruption to it could be energetically costly. These studies were part of my PhD work at the University of New Hampshire and capitalized on an existing project out of the university's Center for Coastal and Ocean Mapping, which was to characterize the radiation pattern of the deep water 12 kilohertz multibeam. 2 multibeam mapping surveys were conducted off of San Clemente Island in Southern California at the Navy's Anti-Submarine Warfare Range, one in January of 2017 and the other in January 2019. It's worth noting here that the multi-sector and multi-swath capabilities that Mike talked about earlier were features utilized during these surveys, as is common practice for deep water mapping. The Navy range includes an 1,800 square kilometer area with 89 bottom-mounted hydrophones spread 2 to 6 kilometers apart from one another, as indicated by the red dots over this bathymetry map on the right side of the slide. With a sampling rate of 96 kilohertz, these hydrophones are capable of capturing marine mammals in the area, as well as the signal from the multibeam. So Mike spent a lot of time helping us understand what the characteristics are of this sound source, but how does that manifest in the marine acoustic environment? This first animation I'm going to show you shows the broadband sound exposure levels for each 1 minute of the acoustic data set recorded before, during, and after the mapping survey of 2017 over the Navy hydrophone array. Overlaid, you'll see ship track lines indicated by a black line with an arrow during each interval of the animation. So I'll note that the color bar used here is Virides, which is on a linear scale, which corresponds well with human perception of sound in comparison to some other color bar choices. And the color bar indicates sound exposure levels values ranging from 73 to 145 decibels, RE 1 micropascal squared seconds. So you'll notice that it's really only a few hydrophones closest to the survey vessel that change color, corresponding to an increase in the broadband sound levels. The next animation shows the power spectral density levels of the 12.5 kilohertz decadecade band of each 1 minute of the acoustic data set, again, before, during, and after the mapping survey on the range hydrophones. This frequency band contains energy from the deep water multibeam signal. Overlaid, you'll again see the ship track lines, this time shown with a white line. The color bar here ranges from 10 to 100 decibels, RE 1 micropascal squared per hertz. And you'll notice that the color bar is different from the last slide. Here it's jet, which is not on a linear scale. And it's used here so we can see the changes in the sound levels more easily, although this visual change is not necessarily representative of the actual order of magnitude of change in the sound levels. So what I hope you can take from this is that the multibeam signal is not captured across the entire array, but rather on several of the closest hydrophones to the survey vessel, up to about 2 to 3 hydrophones away from the survey position. The final animation I want to show you for this part of the work shows the soundscape perspective from a single hydrophone in the center of the array, shown in the figure on the left as a red dot. This animation provides intuition for the changing sound levels with respect to the survey vessel location, which again will be shown as a black line moving throughout the animation on the left. The animation on the right are the spectral sound levels recorded on that single red hydrophone during the mapping survey of 2017. And I want to draw your attention specifically to the label 10 to the 4th, which is around the nominal operating frequency of this multibeam. Okay, so you can see the black line on the figure on the left about to come on the range. The survey hasn't started quite yet. This is just the vessel moving around the range. And now the survey starts with the multibeam. So you'll notice that as the survey vessel gets closer to the hydrophone, that 10 to the 4th signal peaks, and as the vessel moves away, decreases. Gets closer, you can see that signal, and as it moves away, you see it go away. So there are 2 things I hope you can see from this video. First, that the sound levels most drastically changed in that known frequency band of the multibeam Echosounder around 12 kilohertz. And also that it's only within a very close distance to that hydrophone that the sound levels were elevated and not the entire time the survey vessel was on the range. So how does the 12 kilohertz multibeam manifest in the marine acoustic environment? The multibeam signal was detectable within a finite distance of the survey vessel, about 17 kilometers or 2 to 3 hydrophones from where the survey vessel was. And when I say detectable, I mean that in terms of the computer that I was using to analyze the data was able to detect it. And that doesn't necessarily equate to animal perception or human perception. The multibeam signal manifests most clearly as elevated sound levels around the nominal operating frequency of the multibeam, again, 12 kilohertz here. And the multibeam activity is loud, but it's temporally and spatially intermittent and not broadband. So what is the effect of all of this on the foraging behavior of beaked whales? More specifically, does beaked whale foraging behavior change before, during, and after a deep water mapping survey? To answer this question, we again capitalized on those 2 multibeam surveys at the Navy Range in 2017 and 2019. The Navy Range is also home to a highly resonant population segment of Cuvier's beaked whales. Changes to beaked whale foraging behavior have commonly been studied with respect to Navy sonar, and so a similar approach was used here as in those studies, which was to look at changes in foraging characteristics of a group vocal period, or GVP. A GVP is a temporally and spatially unique set of vocalizations representing a single group of beaked whales vocalizing during a deep foraging dive. The foraging clicks that amass a group vocal period can be detected on the range hydrophones. As I said earlier, beaked whales have been shown to be sensitive to MFAS, mid-frequency active sonar. There have been several studies utilizing U.S. Navy training facilities and their large-scale hydrophone arrays that have clearly shown the adverse effect of MFAS on beaked whales foraging behavior. For example, in 2011, there was a study conducted on the Navy Range in the Bahamas assessing Blainville's beaked whale foraging behavior before, during, and after MFAS training exercises. The left figure here shows the average number of group vocal periods per hour on the range during these periods. where the foraging decreases severely during sonar activity and slowly recovers afterward. In the right figure is a spatial assessment of the same data set showing foraging intensity on a heat map. There's a fair amount of foraging activity throughout the range before sonar activity, but during the naval exercises, there's virtually no foraging activity in the middle of the range. A concurrent study actually showed that tagged beaked whales left the range during this study, during the training exercise. So this has also been an effective method for looking at changes in foraging behavior during military training exercises, and a similar approach was taken here to look at the effect of multibeams on beaked whales. So first we took a cursory look at the group focal period detections on the hydrophone array during the mapping survey of 2017. This animation shows just that. The green circles indicate the hydrophones, and when a group focal period was detected on a hydrophone, it turns red. This animation shows you where one or more group focal period detections were made in 10-minute increments before, during, and after the 2017 mapping survey. So here are the detections of group focal periods made on the hydrophones before the survey starts. And when the survey starts, you'll see a black line representing the survey vessel's location come on to the animation. So just take notice of where the detections are being made. Here comes the survey vessel. And then the survey vessel leaves the range. Watch for a few more seconds, the detections that occur afterwards. So there's two takeaways from this. First, foraging continues on the range throughout the survey. And secondly, there's no visually discernible change in where foraging takes place. So digging into this data a bit more, 4 group focal period characteristics were evaluated for changes in foraging behavior before, during, and after the surveys. These characteristics were the number of group focal periods per hour, the number of clicks per group focal period, the duration of a group focal period, and the click rate per group focal period. There were 2 multi-beam surveys, and they were pooled together for this analysis. So what do we find? The results here are summarized in box and whisker plots, which shows the distribution of data for each of the 3 analysis periods, before, during, and after, and each of the 4 group focal period characteristics. In terms of the number of group focal periods per hour, there were more group focal periods per hour during and after the multi-beam survey compared with before. The number of clicks per group focal period were similar among all 3 analysis periods. That was the same case with the group focal period duration, similar across all 3 analysis periods. And the click rate per group focal period was actually higher after the multi-beam survey in comparison with before. In summary, there is no difference between the multi-beam and non-multi-beam periods in 3 of 4 of the group focal period characteristics. There were more group focal periods during the multi-beam survey than there were before, which suggests an increase in foraging effort. This is a marked difference from similar studies assessing changes in beaked whale foraging behavior during Navy sonar use, when the number of group focal periods decreased. There was also differences identified in 2 of the 4 group focal period characteristics between the non-multi-beam periods, suggesting that there are other important factors at play that could potentially impact foraging. For example, foraging by beaked whales is highly dependent on prey abundance and behavior, which were not assessed in the study. The last empirical study I will talk about today looked at the spatial use of the hydrophone range by foraging beaked whales during the multi-beam mapping surveys to answer the question of whether deep water mapping affects where beaked whales forage. So the same 2 deep water multi-beam mapping surveys were considered, the same before, during, and after design, and the same beaked whale group focal period data sets. This time, though, the observations were considered static within those time periods, and the spatial dimension was considered. The two data sets were not pooled together for this analysis, as there was no reason to expect that animals would forage precisely in the same location across the 2 years. And secondly, the mapping surveys had slightly different configurations on the array, which you can see in the figures on the right of the slide for the 2 respective years. Since the number of group focal periods were the only group focal period characteristic that varied between multibeam and non-multibeam periods in the last analysis, that was the only group focal period characteristic considered in this study. One of the strengths of these data sets was the large-scale nature of where the observations came from, providing the ability to look over a large region for any changes in foraging behavior. Large-scale changes would arguably indicate a biologically important response if one were seen. To look for these large-scale spatial changes, 3 metrics were considered. First, a global metric that evaluates whether the pattern of foraging changed across the entire array, so were group focal periods spatially clustered, dispersed, or randomly distributed. The second metric identified more localized change in foraging activity, where specifically are relative hot and cold spots of foraging effort across the 3 periods. And finally, a comparison was made as to whether the order of magnitude of the group focal periods detected within each analysis period changed across the 3 periods. And that was necessary since the spatial statistics do not provide this sort of information. Moving into the results for 2017, let's first orient you to this, what you're looking at. In the top left is a figure of the multibeam survey track lines over the hydrophone array for the specific year. In the center of the slide, we have the number of group focal periods presented by hydrophone for each of the 3 analysis periods in the left-hand column, where the warmer colors indicate more group focal periods per hydrophone and the cooler colors indicate fewer. The plus signs indicate the spatial distribution of the group focal periods and that they were clustered. And the right-hand column of the middle figure shows where relative hot and cold spots of foraging effort are located, where the red indicates a relative hot spot and blue indicates a relative cold spot. And finally, the figure in the bottom right conveys the same information as that left-hand column of the center figure, just another way of showing the number of group focal periods per hydrophone. This information was used to answer the question of whether the magnitude of foraging effort was similar across analysis periods. Overall, the analysis for 2017 showed that the foraging effort remained clustered throughout all 3 analysis periods. Particularly, there were hotspots of foraging effort that remained in the northwest corner of the array throughout all 3 analysis periods, and the order of magnitude was similar across all 3 analysis periods. The results for 2019 are presented in a similar way. Foraging effort again remained clustered before, during, and after the multibeam survey of 2019. Foraging effort was concentrated in the southern corner of the array before the survey, more centrally during the survey, and distributed more broadly across the center of the array after the survey. The overall magnitude of foraging effort remained the same across all 3 analysis periods. So did the deep water mapping surveys affect where beaked whales foraged? In 2017, there was no change in where beaked whales foraged. In 2019, there was no array-wide change in where animals foraged and no overall magnitude change in how much foraging occurred, but there was a shift in where animals foraged within the array. It's important to note that this was a shift toward the center of the array and a marked difference from an avoidance response leaving the array. Additionally, foraging remained in an area that has been historically well utilized by foraging Cuvier's beaked whales. It's possible that the prey distribution was a driving factor of where the animals were foraging, but again, that wasn't possible to assess in this study. To summarize these empirical studies, animals did not leave the range and continued to forage during both deepwater multibeam mapping surveys. There was no change detected in 3 of the 4 temporal metrics of foraging behavior that were examined. There was an increase in the number of foraging events observed during the survey, but this was a stark contrast from other studies of anthropogenic sounds with known adverse effects on beaked whale foraging. There was no change in spatial use of the array during one multibeam survey, and only a localized change detected during the other. But again, it was a shift toward the center of the array, not indicative of an avoidance response. Overall, there was no adverse change observed in the foraging behavior of Cuvier's beaked whales. In conclusion, again, the likelihood of direct insonification that could lead to auditory injury is low. The 12 kilohertz multibeam mapping signals contributes substantially to the local soundscape around the survey vessel, but is spatially and temporally intermittent on a broader scale. The empirical assessment discussed here of a sensitive species during a deep water mapping survey while performing a biologically important behavior showed no adverse effect and no clear response to multibeam. The 12 kilohertz multibeam represents the largest multibeam acoustic footprint, and Cuvier's beaked whales are a sensitive species to other anthropogenic sounds. Therefore, the effects observed here should represent an upper bound on the potential interaction of multibeams with marine life. And with that, I think Mike and I would be happy to take any questions.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, Hillary, and thank you, Michael, for your very informative talks today. We have a couple questions in the Q&A that we have time to answer. So I guess we'll just do one each. So for Michael, there's a question, if you could explain how the Kongsberg whale warning mode works.
So I do know that there is a source level ramp mode that essentially reduces the maximum source level on the system, and will slowly ramp that up with time. That allows any marine life within the area to be aware that the system's there and be prepared for it, I guess. So it'll nominally start at negative 20 dB relative to the maximum value and slowly ramp up. And this is a setting you can change within the system.
All right, thank you. And we just have time for one question for Hillary. From Veronica, thank you for the presentation. You showed that GVP increased during and after the noise event compared to before it. What are your hypotheses to explain this trend?
Honestly, I think there's just a lot of variability in, animal behavior. So we could look back at the numbers, and it's a statistical difference, but is it a biologically significant difference? That's a question that I can't answer. So I think it's animal behavior variability. It could, yeah, I could speculate, but I'll stop there.
All right, thank you. So I'm just going to share the last couple slides here. So thank you to all of our participants today, and thank you for joining us. And again, thank you to our speakers for your very informative talks. That concludes today's webinar. So for those of you who joined us over Zoom and registered via the registration link, you will get an email following the conclusion of this webinar that summarizes the talks, as well as includes the Q&A or the answers to the Q&A that we didn't get to throughout the webinar. In that email, there are also 2 links to the webinar survey, as well as the questionnaire and information regarding the professional development certificate that you will get if you attend all 4 webinars in 2024. Today was the 3rd webinar, so if you've joined for the last 2 plus today and you join us in October, then you will get a professional development certificate from DOSITS. And those details will be in the email. Our next webinar will be on impulsive sound in offshore wind, and that will be noon, same time, on October 16th, so just about a month away. That concludes today, so thank you to everyone for joining for this webinar, and keep an eye out for the follow-up email. With that, I guess we will... Oh, and also for those of you who are still online, feel free to go to the DOSITS website, dosits.org, and explore around. There's a lot of great information on there for getting started and getting your feet wet with acoustics, learning about regulations, listening to some audio sounds in the gallery, and just all kinds of cool stuff. So yeah, go there and have a good time.